The gas giant Vero filled the sky, its swirling storms of purple and blue casting a soft glow through the dome of mining colony V9. Lyra stood alone at the observation deck, her six-fingered hand pressed against the glass. Unlike the other workers heading to their quarters after a long shift, she chose to linger. Solitude had become her closest companion. "You're still here." The harsh voice of Supervisor Droll cut through her moment of peace. "Maintenance level needs cleaning. Now." Lyra turned, keeping her eyes downcast as all lower-class Vexians were expected to do. But Droll stepped closer, his tall frame looming over her. "Look at me when I speak to you," he ordered. Slowly, Lyra raised her face. The supervisor's expression shifted from annoyance to disgust as he stared at her eyes. Unlike the single large eyes of pure-blood Vexians, Lyra's face featured compound eyes. Dozens of small hexagonal facets that caught the light in unusual ways. They gave her exceptional vision, but marked her as different, as flawed. "Disgusting," Droll muttered. "Why they keep defectives like you is beyond me. Hurry up. The waste pipes need clearing." After he left, Lyra made her way down the service corridors, passing groups of other Vexians who either ignored her or whispered as she passed. Her enhanced hearing caught snippets of their conversations. "The Bug Eyes is on duty again. Don't look directly at her. It's bad luck." Lyra entered the maintenance level and picked up her tools. The work was dirty and dangerous, but she found a strange comfort in the mechanical problems she solved daily. Machines didn't care what she looked like. They either worked or they didn't. As she repaired a broken filtration unit, her mind wandered to what might have been. Before her physical differences became apparent, she had scored at the top of her tactical training class. The military academy had even shown interest until their second metamorphosis revealed her genetic anomaly. Tactical minds must come in acceptable bodies, the academy director had told her parents. The troops would never follow someone who looks like that. The colony's emergency alert system suddenly blared to life, interrupting her thoughts. Red lights pulsed along the corridors. "All personnel report to your designated safety zones," the automated voice announced. "Leadership Council meeting in progress." Curious, Lyra closed her toolkit and made her way to a service duct that ran behind the council chambers. Years of being invisible had taught her all the hidden paths through the colony. She positioned herself near a ventilation grate where she could hear the proceedings. "The distress signal is clear," a voice she recognized as Defense Chief Mork said. "The Trellian mining outpost has fallen under attack from Krell forces." "The Trellians are not our concern," replied Elder Vox, the colony's leader. "Their outpost is 3 light years away." "But the Krell have never ventured this far into our sector before," Mork argued. "If they've taken Trellian space, we could be next." "Speculation," Elder Vox dismissed. "We have our defense grid. We have our agreements with other Vexian colonies. We will not risk our resources helping outsiders." Lyra frowned. From her studies of old military texts she'd secretly accessed, she knew the Krell tactics. They isolated their targets before attacking, cutting off potential allies one by one. The leadership was making a terrible mistake. As the meeting adjourned, Lyra slipped away and returned to her workstation. She pulled out her personal data pad, a discarded model she'd repaired, and began calculating. If the Krell followed their usual patterns, they would reach Vexian space within 2 standard months. The colony needed allies, not isolation. They needed preparation, not complacency. But who would listen to her? In the reflection of her screen, her compound eyes stared back at her, a constant reminder of why her voice would never matter here. Lyra closed her data pad and returned to fixing the broken pipes. For now, that was all they thought she was good for. But deep inside, a small flame of determination continued to burn. Something was coming, and when it did, perhaps then, they would see beyond her eyes. 3 weeks passed since the council meeting. Lyra was elbow-deep in sewage pipes when the colony's alarms blared again. This time, the tone was different, Higher, more urgent. Unknown vessel approaching. All defense personnel to stations. The announcement echoed through the maintenance tunnels. Lyra quickly cleaned her hands and made her way to the nearest viewing port. The other workers gathered there too, their usual disdain for her forgotten in the excitement. "Is it the Krell?" someone whispered. Through the port, Lyra spotted a ship limping toward the colony. It looked nothing like Krell design. Smoke trailed from one side, and parts of its hull glowed red from recent weapons fire. The ship was smaller than Vexian cruisers, but had a sturdy, practical look to it. "It's sending a transmission," a security officer announced to the crowd. The main screen flickered to life. Lyra gasped along with the others. A creature stood on the bridge of the damaged ship. It had no scales, no proper exoskeleton, just soft-looking skin and fur on top of its head. Two simple round eyes, a protruding nose, and only 5 fingers on each hand. A human, Lyra realized. She had read about them in old data files, but never seen one. "This is Captain Jack Rivers of the human space vessel Defiant." The creature spoke in a deep voice. "We request emergency docking and repair assistance. We escaped a Krell attack on the Trellian outpost and have wounded aboard." The screen went dark as the transmission was cut. Officials hurried the workers away from the viewing port. "Return to your stations," Supervisor Droll shouted. "This is not your concern." But instead of going back to the pipes, Lyra slipped into a maintenance shaft that led toward the main docking bay. If humans had fought the Krell and survived, she needed to learn more. Hours later, after much argument among the colony leadership, the damaged human ship was allowed to dock in the far bay, the one used for quarantine and potentially dangerous materials. Lyra watched from behind a ventilation grate as 6 humans emerged, led by Captain Rivers. Up close, humans were even stranger than they appeared on screen. They moved differently than Vexians, with a confident stride that seemed almost aggressive. The tallest one, Rivers, spoke with Elder Vox while 4 armed Vexian guards watched closely. "The Krell attacked without warning," Rivers explained. "They've taken the entire Trellian system. We were part of a trade delegation. Most of our fleet was destroyed." "Unfortunate," Elder Vox replied coldly. "But Vexian policy is clear. We do not involve ourselves in conflicts between other species." "This isn't about other species anymore," Rivers argued. "The Krell are moving through this sector systematically. You'll be next." The Elder waved a dismissive hand. "We will allow your ship to dock for 3 days. You may conduct essential repairs. Nothing more." As the humans were escorted to a contained area and the officials dispersed, Lyra noticed something interesting. The humans had left repair equipment on the dock, and no one was watching it. She slipped out from her hiding place and approached the strange tools. One device looked like a scanner of some kind. Lyra picked it up carefully, turning it over in her 6-fingered hands. The design was elegant yet simple, different from Vexian technology, but somehow more practical. "I wouldn't touch that if I were you." Lyra spun around. Captain Rivers stood a few feet away, having doubled back without his escort. He didn't look angry, just curious. For a moment, they stared at each other, the human with his 2 round eyes, and the Vexian with her compound ones. Lyra waited for the disgust, the look of revulsion she always received. Instead, Rivers tilted his head slightly. "That's a structural integrity scanner," he said, pointing to the device in her hands. "But you've already figured that out, haven't you?" Lyra's eyes widened in surprise. This human didn't seem repulsed by her appearance, and somehow he had noticed her intelligence with just a glance. "Yes," she replied softly. "I think I have." "You're not supposed to be here," Captain Rivers said, but his tone wasn't threatening. He glanced at the doorway to make sure they were alone. Lyra carefully placed the scanner down. "Neither are you. Your escorts think you're resting." Rivers smiled. It was a strange expression to Lyra. Vexians didn't show teeth when pleased. "I gave them the slip. Wanted to check on my ship without officials watching my every move." He studied her for a moment. You're different from the others. Lyra looked down. Yes, I am. Defective. That's not what I meant. Rivers stepped closer. You were studying that scanner like you understood it. The others look at our tech like it's dirty or primitive. Lyra hesitated, then decided to be honest. I find your designs logical. Vexian technology is often made to look beautiful first, functional second. Rivers nodded. Form over function. We humans learned that lesson the hard way in our early wars. A noise from outside made them both tense. I should go, Lyra said quickly. Wait. Rivers pulled a small device from his pocket. Take this. It's a data pad with repair manuals for our systems. Maybe you can help us fix our ship faster. Lyra stared at the offered device. Why would you trust me? Call it a soldier's instinct, Rivers replied. I recognize useful skills when I see them. The next day, Lyra was assigned to the maintenance team working in the lower sections of the human ship. While other Vexians complained about the strange smells and odd design, Lyra marveled at the efficient systems. Thanks to Rivers' manual, she understood the human technology better than her supervisors. This cooling system is genius, she muttered to herself as she worked on a damaged section. Simple but effective. Most people don't call our old rust bucket genius, a voice said behind her. Rivers had appeared again, this time in work clothes rather than his uniform. Captain, Lyra acknowledged. Your ship has survived a Krell attack. That makes it impressive. Rivers crouched beside her. How did you know to adjust the coolant mixture like that? Our manual doesn't cover that trick. I noticed the mineral content in your colony's water supply is different from what your system expects. I calculated the necessary adjustment. Rivers' expression changed to one of deep interest. You calculated that? How? Lyra tapped her compound eyes. I see patterns others miss. Wavelengths, frequencies, subtle color changes in the coolant. For the next hour, they talked as Lyra worked. Rivers explained the battle with the Krell, their tactics, their weaknesses. Lyra shared her knowledge of local space, pointing out blind spots in Vexian defenses. You have a tactical mind, Rivers said. Why aren't you in your defense force? Lyra gestured to her face. No one follows a commander who looks like me. Rivers shook his head. On Earth, we learned the hard way that appearance means nothing in battle. Results are what matter. Their conversation was interrupted by alarms. Captain Rivers, report to command immediately, a voice announced over the ship's system. Rivers stood quickly. Something's wrong. Come with me. I'm not allowed in command areas, Lyra protested. You are if I say you are, Rivers replied, offering his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Lyra took it. In the command center, the human crew was gathered around a display. They barely glanced at Lyra as Rivers entered. What is it? Rivers asked. His first officer pointed to the screen. Long-range scan just picked this up. 3 Krell scout ships at the edge of the system. The display showed 3 small vessels moving in a search pattern. They're looking for us, Rivers said grimly. No, Lyra spoke up, studying the formation. Everyone turned to look at her. That's not a search pattern. That's a perimeter setup. The main fleet is coming. Rivers turned to her. How can you tell? The spacing, the communication bursts. Lyra pointed to data streams on the screen only her eyes could fully perceive. This is standard Krell invasion protocol. The human crew exchanged looks of alarm. How do you know Krell protocols? The first officer asked suspiciously. Because, Lyra said quietly, I studied every piece of tactical data I could find, even when no one thought I should. Rivers looked at her with new understanding in his eyes. How long do we have? 5 days, maybe less. Rivers nodded decisively. Then we have work to do. The Krell scouts are just a rumor spread by the humans, Helder Vox declared to the council chamber. We will not panic over unconfirmed reports. Lyra stood at the back of the room beside Rivers. After much argument, the human captain had been allowed to address the Vexian leadership, but they weren't listening. With respect, Rivers said firmly, "These aren't rumors. We have sensor data showing Krell scout ships setting up invasion formations." Defense Chief Mork nodded slightly. "Perhaps we should increase patrols as a precaution." "Waste of resources," another elder dismissed. Rivers took a deep breath. "Lyra has analyzed their movement patterns. She can show you exactly what they're planning." The room went silent. Every Vexian eye turned to Lyra. "This maintenance worker." Elder Vox laughed. "What could she possibly know about military tactics?" Rivers stepped aside. "Show them, Lyra." Heart pounding, Lyra walked to the central display. She had never spoken in front of the council before. With shaking hands, she connected the human data pad Rivers had given her. "The Krell use a 3-phase attack strategy," she began. Her voice grew stronger as she focused on the data. "Phase 1. Scout ships establish a perimeter and map defenses. Phase 2. Disruptor vessels disable communications. Phase 3. The main battle fleet arrives." The display showed her simulation of the Krell approach. Even the skeptical elders leaned forward to watch. "Based on their current positions," Lyra continued, "they will attack from these 3 vectors, targeting our communication arrays first." She highlighted the colony's vulnerable points. "If we reposition our defense grid like this," she moved virtual ships around the display, "we can prevent them from—" "Enough." Elder Vox slammed his hand down. "This is absurd. We're listening to a defective maintenance worker playing with military simulations." The room erupted in laughter. Lyra's face burned with shame. "Her physical appearance has nothing to do with her tactical abilities," Rivers argued, but the council had already moved on. Defense Chief Mork presented the official defense plan, a standard formation that would leave the colony exposed to exactly the attack pattern Lyra had predicted. As they left the chamber, Rivers was furious. "They're going to get everyone killed with that strategy." "It doesn't matter," Lyra said quietly. "No one listens to me." "I'm listening," Rivers replied. "And so is my crew." Back on the human ship, Rivers gathered his officers. Though repairs were still underway, the Defiant was at least capable of movement and basic weapons function. "We're implementing Lyra's defensive strategy," Rivers announced, stunning his crew. "Captain," his first officer protested, "we have orders to return to human space as soon as repairs are complete. And leave these people to die." Rivers shook his head. "The Vexians may not believe us, but we know what's coming. If the Krell take this colony, they'll be one step closer to human territory." He turned to Lyra. "What exactly should we do?" For the next day, Lyra worked with the human crew, preparing their ship and developing strategies. The Vexians had reluctantly agreed to let the Defiant participate in defense drills, but they ignored all of Rivers' suggestions. Then, on the 4th day, when the Krell were expected to still be gathering forces, alarms blared throughout the colony. Multiple ships dropping out of faster-than-light travel. The announcement echoed. "All defense vessels deploy immediately." Rivers rushed to the bridge, Lyra right behind him. "They're early," she said, studying the tactical display with her compound eyes. "They must have already had forces nearby." Outside the viewports, dozens of black, angular Krell ships appeared, their weapons already charging. "The Vexian defense grid is deploying in standard formation," reported a crew member. Rivers and Lyra exchanged a look. They both knew what would happen next. The Krell opened fire. In seconds, 3 Vexian defense platforms exploded. "They're targeting exactly where Lyra predicted," Rivers said grimly. Their communication system crackled. Elder Vox appeared on screen, his earlier confidence gone. "Human vessel," he said urgently, "we request immediate assistance. Our defenses are failing." Rivers looked at Lyra. "It's your plan now. What's our move?" For the first time in her life, someone was actually asking for her guidance. Lyra straightened her back and pointed to the display. "Move to these coordinates," she said confidently. and prepare all weapons. Bring us into the gas giant's upper atmosphere, Lyra commanded, her compound eyes tracking multiple targets at once. The radiation belt will mask our energy signature. Rivers nodded to his pilot. You heard her. Do it. The Defiant dove toward the swirling storms of the gas giant Pharaoh. Outside, the Krell ships continued their systematic destruction of the Vexian defense grid. They're not even trying to take prisoners, Rivers said grimly. Krell don't take prisoners, Lyra replied. They harvest resources, including biological ones. The ship shuddered as it entered the outer atmosphere. Warning lights flashed across the control panels. Hull temperature rising, the first officer reported. We can't stay here long. We don't need long, Lyra said. Her fingers moved rapidly across the tactical display. The lead Krell vessel will pass directly overhead in 30 seconds. On the main screen, they watched as a massive Krell destroyer moved into position, firing on the helpless Vexian ships. Weapons ready, Rivers ordered. Not yet, Lyra cautioned, watching the patterns of enemy fire. Their shield harmonics cycle every 17 seconds. Wait for my mark. The bridge crew exchanged nervous glances, but Rivers raised his hand for silence. Trust her, he said simply. Lyra's compound eyes reflected the tactical data, seeing energy patterns invisible to others. 3, 2, 1. Now. Fire all weapons, Rivers commanded. The Defiant burst up from the gas giant's clouds, weapons blazing. Their shots hit the Krell destroyer at precisely the moment its shield cycled. The massive ship shuddered as explosions tore along its underside. Direct hit, the weapons officer shouted. Don't celebrate yet, Lyra warned. Turn hard to port and dive back into the atmosphere. The Defiant banked sharply just as return fire from other Krell ships sliced through the space they had occupied seconds before. That was too close, Rivers muttered. But effective, Lyra replied, pointing to the display. The damaged Krell destroyer was falling out of formation, its weapons offline. Over the comm system, they heard Vexian commanders expressing shock. How did they do that? One human ship damaged a Krell destroyer. Lyra leaned over to Rivers. We need to strike again before they adjust their tactics. Rivers nodded. Where next? Here, Lyra highlighted another location. If we take out their command ship's communication array, we can disrupt their coordination. For the next 20 minutes, the Defiant struck from hiding places in the gas giant's storms, damaging 3 more Krell vessels before retreating. Each attack was precisely timed by Lyra to exploit weaknesses only her eyes could see. On the colony, the Vexian command center watched in disbelief. How is one ship doing this? Elder Vox demanded. Defense Chief Mork studied the tactical display. They're using the strategy that maintenance worker showed us. Impossible, Vox insisted, but the evidence was clear. Back on the Defiant, Rivers received an incoming transmission. Captain, Elder Vox appeared on screen, his pride clearly wounded. We request tactical coordination. Rivers looked at Lyra, who stood just out of view of the transmission. She nodded. We'll coordinate, Rivers agreed, but only if Lyra leads the tactical operation. There was a long pause. The defect. Vox caught himself. The worker? Why? Because she's the only one who can see the patterns in Krell defenses, Rivers said firmly. It's her plan that's kept us alive so far. Another pause. Then, very well. Send her to command. When Lyra entered the Vexian command center with Rivers beside her, the room fell silent. Officers who had mocked her now stared with uncertainty. The Krell command ship is moving into position for their final assault, Defense Chief Mork said, breaking the awkward silence. Lyra stepped forward, her compound eyes scanning the tactical displays. For a moment, she remembered all the times these same officers had laughed at her, dismissed her, treated her as less than nothing. Then she pushed those thoughts aside. Move all remaining defense platforms to these coordinates, she said, her voice clear and confident. Captain Rivers will position the Defiant here. When I give the signal, we strike together." To her surprise, no one questioned her. They simply obeyed. As the officers rushed to implement her orders, Rivers leaned close. "How does it feel?" he asked quietly. Lyra watched as the Vexians followed her commands without hesitation for the first time in her life. "It feels right," she answered. "The Krell command ship is adjusting its position," a Vexian officer announced. "They're preparing for a final assault on the colony." Lyra studied the massive enemy vessel through the command center's main view screen. It was 3 times larger than any other ship in the Krell fleet, with weapons that could reduce the entire colony to dust. "They're confident," she observed. "Too confident." Rivers stood beside her, his human presence drawing curious glances from the Vexian officers. "What are you thinking?" Lyra's compound eyes narrowed as she analyzed the enemy formation. The Krell believe they've won. They're focusing all their shield power forward, expecting a desperate head-on attack. "Isn't that what we're doing?" asked Defense Chief Mork. "No," Lyra replied with a slight smile. "That's what we want them to think we're doing." She turned to the communications officer. "Open a channel to all remaining Vexian ships." For the next few minutes, Lyra outlined her plan. It was risky, unconventional, and nothing like standard Vexian tactics. Several officers objected, but Rivers backed her at every turn. "I've seen her strategies work," he told them. "Trust her." Finally, Elder Vox gave his approval. "We have little choice. Proceed with the plan." The remaining Vexian defense vessels moved into position, appearing to form a last stand formation directly in front of the colony. The Defiant took point position. "The Krell are taking the bait," Rivers reported from his ship. "They're concentrating their forces to punch through our center. Hold position." Lyra commanded. "Wait for my signal." On the command ship's tactical display, the Krell fleet began its advance. Their weapons charge, ready to destroy the defenders. "They're in range," a Vexian officer announced nervously. "Not yet," Lyra said, her eyes fixed on patterns only she could see in the energy readings. The Krell opened fire. Their first volley streaked toward the Vexian ships. Evasive action. Someone shouted, "Hold position." Lyra countered firmly. The bridge crew watched in horror as the energy weapons approached. At the last possible second, Lyra shouted, "Now." The Vexian ships activated the modified shield generators Lyra had designed based on human technology. Instead of blocking the Krell weapons, the shields bent the energy around the ships and focused it back toward its source. The Krell's own weapons fire boomeranged back, striking their vessels where their rear shields were weakest. 3 enemy ships exploded instantly. "Second phase," Lyra ordered. The Defiant and 2 Vexian cruisers broke formation, diving beneath the Krell fleet while they were still reeling from the unexpected counterattack. "Target their engine clusters," Lyra directed. "Fire." Precision shots hit the vulnerable engine sections of the Krell command ship. Explosions blossomed along its hull. "Direct hits," Rivers reported jubilantly. For the next 10 minutes, chaos reigned as the battle raged. Following Lyra's unconventional tactics, the defenders struck from unexpected angles, always targeting the weaknesses her compound eyes identified in Krell defenses. The Krell command ship, damaged but still operational, began to retreat. The remaining enemy vessels followed. In the Vexian command center, stunned silence gave way to cheers. Officers who had never spoken to Lyra before rushed to congratulate her. "You saved us all," Defense Chief Mork admitted, bowing his head slightly. Elder Vox approached more slowly. "Your strategy was effective," he said stiffly. Lyra nodded but said nothing. She knew this wasn't true acceptance, just desperation and relief. Later, as the colony began repairs, a small ceremony was held. Elder Vox presented Lyra with a minor service medal, the kind typically given to support staff who worked extra shifts. "In recognition of your contribution," he said, avoiding her compound eyes. Rivers watched from the side, his expression darkening. After the ceremony, he approached Lyra. "That's it," he asked. A support staff medal after you saved their entire colony. Lyra fingered the small medal. It's more than I ever expected from them. Rivers shook his head. You deserve better. His communication device beeped. Looking at it, his face brightened. The Human Alliance fleet has responded to our distress call. They'll be here in 12 hours. He looked at Lyra with determination. When they arrive, I have something important to discuss with you. What? Lyra asked. Rivers smiled. Your future. The Human Alliance fleet arrived with impressive force. 12 warships that dwarfed both the Defiant and the Vexian vessels. Elder Vox and the Council hurried to arrange a formal welcome, suddenly eager to establish friendly relations with such a powerful group. Lyra watched from her usual place in the background as Rivers greeted Admiral Blake, a tall human woman with short gray hair and commanding presence. Captain Rivers, the Admiral said warmly. Your message said this was urgent. It is, Rivers replied, but not for the reasons the Vexians think. He gestured for Lyra to join them. Hesitantly, she stepped forward. Admiral Blake studied Lyra with interest, showing no reaction to her compound eyes. This is the tactical genius you mentioned. Yes, Rivers said proudly. Without Lyra, we'd all be dead. She predicted the Krell attack pattern and developed the counter-strategy that drove them off. The Admiral extended her hand in the human greeting gesture. The Alliance needs minds like yours, Lyra. Before Lyra could respond, Elder Vox interrupted, suddenly appearing at their side. Admiral, welcome to our colony. We've prepared a formal reception in your honor. The reception was held in the colony's Grand Hall. For the first time, Lyra was allowed inside, though she was seated at the very back. She listened as Elder Vox presented the battle as a great Vexian victory, mentioning the humans' assistance only briefly and Lyra not at all. When Rivers was asked to speak, he stood and looked directly at Lyra. The victory belongs to someone who saw what others refused to see, he said clearly. Someone whose difference gave her the ability to save us all. A murmur ran through the crowd as Rivers beckoned Lyra forward. Reluctantly, she joined him at the front. Admiral Blake. Rivers continued, the Human Alliance has always valued ability over appearance. I formally request that Lyra be offered a position in our tactical division. The room went silent. Elder Vox's face darkened with anger and embarrassment. This is highly irregular, he protested. Lyra is a Vexian citizen. A citizen you've treated as less than nothing. Rivers interrupted. A brilliant mind you assigned to clean waste pipes because her eyes didn't match your standard of beauty. Admiral Blake raised her hand for silence. In recognition of her extraordinary service, I am authorized to offer Lyra a full commission in the Human Alliance fleet with the rank of tactical advisor. She turned to Lyra. The choice is yours. Lyra looked around the room. Some Vexians looked shocked, others disgusted. A few, those who had worked with her during the battle, showed a hint of respect. Defense Chief Mork gave her a small nod. Supervisor Droll, who had ordered her around for years, suddenly stepped forward. Lyra, he said with a forced smile, perhaps we could discuss your reassignment to a more suitable position here in the colony. Others quickly joined in, suddenly seeing her value now that humans wanted her. Lyra felt a strange calm settle over her. All her life, she had wanted acceptance from her people. Now, when it was finally offered, she realized it wasn't what she truly needed. Thank you, Admiral, she said. I accept your offer. 3 days later, Lyra stood on the bridge of the Human Alliance flagship, Horizon. Her few possessions were packed, her goodbyes said to the few Vexians who had actually treated her with kindness. Captain Rivers, now promoted to fleet commander, joined her at the viewport as they prepared to leave orbit. Having second thoughts, he asked. Lyra looked back at the colony, then at her reflection in the glass. Her compound eyes, once a mark of shame, now represented her greatest strength. No, she replied. For the first time, I'm exactly where I should be. A young human officer approached them. Advisor Lyra, We've detected unusual energy signatures in the next sector. The patterns match what you described as Krell scout ships. Rivers smiled. Looks like you're needed already. Lyra nodded, turning away from her old home toward the stars ahead. Admiral Blake is waiting in the tactical room, the officer continued. She said to tell you that the entire fleet is ready to follow your guidance. Lyra took a deep breath. Then let's not keep them waiting. As she walked through the corridors of the human ship, crew members nodded to her with respect. No one stared at her eyes. No one whispered behind her back. They saw only her abilities, her worth. She was finally home.